The Commonwealth War Graves Commission was founded on a noble promise that every soldier who fell in the Great War would be honored equally, regardless of rank, background, or creed. Their iconic, identical headstones populate cemeteries across the world, a silent testament to a principle of equality in death. But it was a lie. For hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a secret policy dictated their memory was not to be honored, but erased. Their final resting places were intentionally abandoned, their names struck from the rolls of the remembered. This is the story of how the British Empire decided which of its heroes to forget, and the fight, a century later, to reclaim their names from the silence. To understand the scale of the betrayal, you must first understand the revolutionary nature of the promise. When the Great War began in 1914, there was no formal system for recording or marking the graves of fallen soldiers. Makeshift wooden crosses are often the only markers, frequently lost in the chaos of subsequent battles. The man who saw this crisis most clearly was Fabian Ware, a 45-year-old journalist too old to enlist, commanded a mobile Red Cross ambulance unit in France. He was struck by the impermanence of these graves and began a personal mission to record them, fearing a generation of sacrifice would be lost to the mud. His unit was soon absorbed into the British Army, becoming the Graves Registration Commission. But Ware had a grander vision. He believed that the shared sacrifice of the British Empire demanded a unified and permanent form of remembrance. He submitted a memorandum to the Imperial War Conference, and on May 21, 1917, the Imperial War Graves Commission, or IWGC, was established by royal charter. Its core principle was radical for the rigid, class-obsessed society of the time: equality of treatment in death. In the words of the commission, what was done for one should be done for all, and that all, whatever their military rank or position in civil life, should have equal treatment in their graves. This meant no repatriation of bodies, a policy that prevented the wealthy from bringing their sons home to elaborate family tombs. Instead, a general would lie beside a private, under identical headstones in the soil where they fell. This principle was immediately tested. Princess Beatrice, whose son Prince Maurice of Battenberg was the highest-ranking aristocrat to die in the war, initially wanted a custom grave. However, the commission held firm, and she was eventually persuaded to accept the standard headstone, making his grave a powerful example of this new equality. The commission enlisted three of the most famous architects of the day, Sir Edwin Lutyens, Sir Herbert Baker, and Sir Reginald Blomfield, to design the cemeteries. They created places of serene, haunting beauty, with row upon row of uniform headstones made from enduring white Portland stone. The commission also needed a voice, someone to capture the immense scale of the loss in words. For this, Ware turned to the Nobel Prize-winning writer Rudyard Kipling. Kipling, whose own son John was killed in 1915, became the commission's literary advisor. He chose the phrase, "Their name liveth forevermore," for the stones of remembrance found in larger cemeteries, and for the thousands of headstones marking the graves of the unidentified, he provided the achingly poignant epitaph, "Known unto God." The vision was clear: a democratic and permanent memorial to every single man who died for the empire, honored equally forever. It was a beautiful, noble lie. The promise of equality, so rigidly applied in the cemeteries of Europe, began to fray at the edges of empire. The Great War was not, as often portrayed, a solely European conflict. It was an imperial one. More than 3 million people from Britain's colonies and dominions served, and it's estimated that upwards of 500,000 died. From the moment King George V called for men of every class, creed, and color to join the fight, the British Empire mobilized its global subjects on an unprecedented scale. Over 1 million soldiers from the Indian subcontinent fought on multiple fronts, from the Western Front to Mesopotamia. In Africa, hundreds of thousands were recruited, not just as soldiers, but as laborers in the vast carrier corps, performing the brutal, back-breaking work of supplying the armies. Volunteers from the Caribbean paid for their own passage to fight for the mother country. However, the military structure they entered was far from equal. It was a rigid hierarchy that reflected the racial and social prejudices of the era. While soldiers from dominions like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand were generally treated as peers to their British counterparts, the same was not true for non-white colonial troops. Indian soldiers fought under British officers, and despite their proven bravery, they were subject to different pay scales and systems of command. African soldiers, serving in regiments like the King's African Rifles, were positioned at the bottom of this hierarchy. They were often denied the same level of equipment, medical care, and recognition as their white comrades. This pre-existing inequality in service would create the foundation for an even greater inequality in death. While the IWGC meticulously planned the great cemeteries and memorials that would dominate the landscape of France and Belgium, a different conversation was happening within the corridors of the Colonial Office and the War Office. As the war progressed, it became clear that applying the European model of commemoration to theaters of war in Africa and the Middle East would be complex. The terrain was more difficult, the distances vast, and the record-keeping often chaotic. But beyond these logistical challenges laid a deeper, more insidious problem, a profound difference in attitude. The men who died in these far-flung campaigns were seen not as equal partners in a shared sacrifice, but as imperial subjects whose customs and value systems were deemed fundamentally different and inferior. The very idea that a soldier from the Gold Coast or a carrier from East Africa deserved the same permanent individual headstone as a soldier from London was being quietly but deliberately questioned. The principle of equality in death had an unspoken asterisk, a fault line that ran directly along the boundaries of race and geography. For the hundreds of thousands of non-white soldiers who served under the Union Jack, the promise of being remembered forever was about to be broken. For a century, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, as it was renamed in 1960, presented a history of dignified, equal remembrance. That narrative was shattered in April 2021 with the publication of the report by a special committee the CWGC itself had appointed. The report, prompted by mounting evidence from historians and journalists, was an explosive mea culpa. It concluded that the promise of equality had been betrayed by pervasive racism, and it laid bare the staggering scale of the neglect. The committee found that between 45,000 and 54,000 service members, predominantly of Indian, East African, West African, Egyptian, and Somali origin, were deliberately commemorated unequally. While their European counterparts were guaranteed an individual headstone, these men were often lumped together on collective memorials, their individual identities subsumed into a nameless whole. For others listed as missing, their names weren't engraved on the grand stone memorials dedicated to their European comrades. Instead, they were recorded only in paper registers, hidden from public view and inaccessible to future generations. But this was only the beginning. The report uncovered a far more shocking reality. It estimated that at least another 116,000 casualties were not commemorated by name, or in some horrifying cases, at all. The report conceded that due to incomplete and destroyed records, the true figure could be as high as 350,000 men. The vast majority of these unremembered were the African and Egyptian personnel who had served as soldiers, carriers, and laborers, particularly in the grueling East African campaign. The committee, chaired by CWGC Commissioner Sir Tim Hitchens and researched by staff historians, found that the IWGC was either directly responsible for or complicit in these decisions. While logistical challenges were a factor, the report stated unequivocally that in many instances, the unequal treatment was avoidable and would not have been tolerated in Europe. The findings prompted an immediate and unreserved apology. In the House of Commons, Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, in his role as chair of the CWGC, apologized on behalf of the government and the Commission for failing to meet the founding principle of equality. Claire Horton, the Director General of the Commission, issued a powerful statement acknowledging the failures. "The events of a century ago were wrong then and are wrong now," she stated. "We recognize the wrongs of the past and are deeply sorry, and will be acting immediately to correct them." The report made it clear that this was not merely an oversight or a series of isolated mistakes. It was the result of entrenched prejudices, preconceptions, and pervasive racism of contemporary imperial attitudes. The very organization founded to ensure every sacrifice was honored had, from its inception, made calculated decisions based on the color of a soldier's skin. The apology was a vital first step, but it came 100 years after the fact, 100 years during which the memory of hundreds of thousands of men was deliberately allowed to fade into nothing. The truth, buried for a century in archival documents and abandoned graves, was finally out in the open. How could an organization founded on the principle of equality justify the erasure of up to 350,000 of its own soldiers? The answer, found in the IWGC's own historical documents and cited in the 2021 report, is a chilling chronicle of institutional racism. The justifications were not born of logistical necessity alone, but of a deeply held colonial ideology that viewed its non-white subjects as fundamentally less civilized and therefore less deserving of remembrance. The evidence is not subtle, it is blatant and damning. Officials at the time did not hide their prejudice, they recorded it as official policy. One of the most common arguments was that African soldiers and their communities simply did not have the same emotional or spiritual connection to their dead as Europeans. A governor in the 1920s wrote that the average native would not understand or appreciate a headstone, a sentiment that was echoed by officials across the continent. This argument was used to justify a policy of abandoning temporary graves to let them revert to nature, and recording names only on paper registers instead of providing permanent stone markers. This dismissal of indigenous feeling was often a deliberate misrepresentation. For instance, many soldiers from West Africa were devout Christians or Muslims, faiths with profound and deeply held burial traditions that were completely ignored by colonial administrators. In their internal communications, officials used dehumanizing language to reinforce their decisions. One document referred to African soldiers as semi-savage, while another argued they were not in a state of civilization as to appreciate such a memorial. This belief that remembrance was a uniquely European concept was a core tenet of the policy. Perhaps the most shocking justification came from a colonial official in 1923, who argued against erecting headstones for African soldiers by suggesting that perhaps in 200 or 300 years' time, when the native population had reached a higher stage of civilization, they might be glad to see that memorials had been erected for their ancestors. The prejudice was so profound that they were willing to postpone honoring a soldier's sacrifice for centuries. Cost was another frequently cited excuse. Erecting and maintaining Portland stone headstones was expensive, and officials deemed it an unnecessary expenditure for what they called mostly illiterate East Africans. The irony was that the principle of equality was meant to transcend cost and class, yet it was being dismantled using the very logic it was designed to defeat. This was a two-tiered system of death. In Europe, every effort was made, every cost borne, to identify and honor each individual. In Africa and the Middle East, racist assumptions about culture and intelligence were used to justify mass neglect. The IWGC, whose mandate was to uphold its principles everywhere, chose instead to defer to the opinions of these local colonial governors, effectively subcontracting its moral responsibility. The report finds that while the IWGC did not always make the decision to diverge from its principles unilaterally, it was complicit in all of them. This was not an accidental failure, it was a philosophy of empire. It was a belief system that saw certain lives, and therefore certain deaths, as being worth less than others. The erasure of these soldiers from memory was not a regrettable byproduct of war, it was the direct, calculated result of a policy of prejudice. The tangible result of this policy of erasure was the systematic whitewashing of the Great War's memory. The physical landscape of commemoration, the thousands of cemeteries and memorials built and maintained by the IWGC, told a profoundly skewed story, the story of a white man's war. This narrative was perhaps most powerfully reinforced in the very places where the contributions of African soldiers and laborers were most significant. The East African Campaign provides the most devastating example. This was a brutal, sprawling conflict fought across modern-day Tanzania, Kenya, and Mozambique. While about 11,000 Commonwealth soldiers died in combat, they were supported by an enormous logistical network of African men, the Carrier Corps. Over 1 million Africans were conscripted, often forcibly, to serve as porters, carriers, and laborers, moving supplies, ammunition, and wounded soldiers through incredibly difficult terrain. They were the backbone of the entire military effort. The death toll among these men was catastrophic. Lacking adequate food, medicine, and shelter, they died in horrifying numbers from disease, exhaustion, and enemy action. While precise figures are impossible to confirm due to poor record-keeping, it is estimated that at least 100,000 members of the Carrier Corps perished. Their contribution was essential and their sacrifice immense, yet their memory was almost completely obliterated. When you visit the pristine Commonwealth War cemeteries in Tanzania today, you see the familiar, orderly rows of white Portland headstones marking the graves of European officers and soldiers. the thousands upon thousands of African men who enabled their campaign, who served and died right alongside them, are simply gone. Their graves, if they were marked at all, were temporary and quickly allowed to vanish back into the bush. Their names were not carved into the grand memorials to the missing. The dominant visual memory of the war in Africa is one of white graves and black absence. This erasure extended across the globe. Indian soldiers who died were sometimes commemorated on collective memorials rather than with individual graves. Egyptian laborers who were essential to the campaigns in the Middle East were treated with similar disregard. The result was a feedback loop of historical amnesia. By scrubbing the immense contribution of African, Indian, and other colonial peoples from the physical record, it became easier for subsequent generations to forget their role entirely. School children visiting war cemeteries saw a conflict fought and won by white faces. Popular history, films, and national remembrance ceremonies focused on the Western Front, further marginalizing the global nature of the war and the diversity of its participants. This, as some have called it, was an industrial-scale cover-up orchestrated through the complicity of the IWGC, the Colonial Office, and the War Office. It was a systemic failure born from an imperial ideology that could not conceive of its non-white subjects as heroes worthy of the same honor and death. The question that hangs over every one of these immaculate European cemeteries is how a nation can reconcile a history where its most sacred promise of remembrance, lest we forget, was predicated on a policy of forgetting hundreds of thousands of its own. For the better part of a century, the scandal of the unremembered remained hidden in plain sight, buried within archival files and in the stark absences in colonial cemeteries. The official history, promoted by the CWGC, remained one of universal, equal commemoration. The process of unearthing the truth was slow, driven not by the institutions that perpetrated the forgetting, but by the tireless work of independent researchers, historians, and journalists. A crucial turning point in this long journey came from the work of Professor Michelle Barrett of Queen Mary University of London. While researching the war, she began to uncover the discrepancies in commemoration and came across the damning internal documents that revealed the racist justifications for the unequal treatment. Her meticulous research formed the academic bedrock for what would become a public explosion of the truth. The catalyst that finally forced the issue into the public consciousness was a powerful 2019 documentary on Britain's Channel 4, titled Unremembered. Presented by Member of Parliament David Lammy, the film was built directly on Professor Barrett's research. Lammy, whose own heritage is Guyanese, brought a passionate and personal perspective to the investigation. The documentary took viewers to the war cemeteries in East Africa, showing the stark contrast between the well-tended graves of European officers and the complete absence of graves for the tens of thousands of African soldiers who died in the same campaign. The film quoted directly from the shocking archival documents, revealing the official discussions about African soldiers being semi-savage and the arguments that headstones would be a waste of public money. For many viewers, this was the first time they had ever heard of this history. The documentary was a direct and powerful accusation, not just against the officials of a century ago, but against the modern institutions that had allowed this history to remain buried. The public and political impact of Unremembered was immediate and profound. It was no longer possible for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to ignore the issue or dismiss it as a historical footnote. Faced with irrefutable evidence presented on national television, the CWGC was compelled to act. In December 2019, it announced the formation of a special committee to investigate the historical inequalities in commemoration. This committee was tasked with diving into the archives and producing a definitive report on the extent of the failures. The investigation confirmed the pervasive racism that underpinned the historical decision-making and gave the official staggering numbers of the unremembered. The committee's final report, published in 2021, was a direct result of the pressure generated by Professor Barrett's research and David Lammy's documentary. While some had previously tried to argue that the failures were simply due to wartime logistics, the committee's findings were crystal clear, concluding that overarching imperial ideology led to the unequal treatment. The cover-up was finally over. The truth had been dragged painstakingly into the light, not by a sudden institutional change of heart, but by the determined efforts of those who refused to let the story die. But revealing the scandal was only half the battle. The work of true remembrance had only just begun. Long before the official apology of 2021, and long before the Unremembered documentary forced a national reckoning, a community decided it would not wait for the establishment to correct the historical record. The fight for recognition was waged from the ground up, by people who refuse to allow their ancestors' sacrifice to be defined by institutional neglect. At the very heart of this movement is the Nubian Jack Community Trust, a British organization founded by Jack Beulah, dedicated to celebrating the historic contributions of Black and minority ethnic people in Britain. For years, the Trust has worked to install commemorative blue plaques and sculptures, ensuring that the presence and achievements of Black Britons are visibly woven into the nation's public spaces. Beulah and the Trust recognized that while there were nearly 70,000 war memorials across the UK, not a single one was specifically dedicated to the more than 2 million African and Caribbean service personnel who had fought for Britain in the two world wars. The project began with the goal of creating a tribute to the Caribbean veterans of World War II, many of whom had arrived in Britain on the MV Empire Windrush in 1948. The initial plan was to place the memorial at Tilbury Docks, the ship's arrival point. However, as the campaign gained momentum, its scope expanded. It grew into a larger vision to honor all African and Caribbean service personnel from both world wars, a tribute to a much broader history of service and sacrifice. With this expanded mission, it was decided that a more central and symbolically significant location was needed. The campaign, which took years of relentless fundraising and lobbying, eventually secured a spot in Windrush Square in Brixton, widely considered the symbolic heart of Black Britain. The location itself was a powerful statement, linking the post-war generation of Caribbean migrants to the long and largely unacknowledged history of Black military service for Britain. This was not a project initiated or funded by the state. It was a grassroots effort supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund, Lambeth Council, and numerous community stakeholders, but driven by the passion and determination of the Nubian Jack Community Trust. It was a victory for a community that had to, in essence, build its own monument because the official narrative of history had failed to do it for them. On June 22, 2017, a date celebrated as Windrush Day, the African and Caribbean War Memorial was unveiled. It stands today as the UK's first national monument of its kind. Its creation was not a gift from a newly enlightened establishment. It was the result of a long, arduous fight by a community to reclaim its own history and build a place of remembrance where one had been so conspicuously absent. It was a defiant act of memory, a community declaring that its heroes would be forgotten no longer. The African and Caribbean War Memorial in Windrush Square is a work of profound symbolic meaning, designed by Jack Beulah to tell a story of service, sacrifice, and reclamation. It is composed of two imposing obelisks carved from dark Scottish whinstone, which stand upon a large pyramid-shaped plinth of Ancaster limestone. The two obelisks are not identical in their positioning. One stands tall and proud, representing the soldiers who served and survived. Its inscription cuts to the heart of the century-long injustice. In memory of the servicemen and women from Africa and the Caribbean who served alongside the forces of the British Commonwealth and her allies during World War I and World War II, remembering the forgotten. The second obelisk lies on its side, as if it has been toppled but is now in the process of being raised back up. This powerful image symbolizes the fallen soldiers, those whose memory was suppressed and is only now being lifted back into the light of history. This lower obelisk is inscribed with a roll call of the forgotten regiments: the King's African Rifles, the British West Indies Regiment, the Rhodesia Native Regiment, the Sudan Defense Force, and many others, finally giving their names a place in stone. The unveiling ceremony on June 22, 2017, was a landmark event filled with a complex mix of pride, validation, and somber reflection. The then Defense Secretary, Sir Michael Fallon, attended and acknowledged that the recognition was long overdue, crediting the bravery and sacrifice of these soldiers for Britain's freedoms. London Mayor Sadiq Khan spoke of the vital need to pass these stories to future generations to ensure they are never again forgotten. The project received messages of support from Queen Elizabeth II and the then Prince of Wales, signifying an official acknowledgement that had been absent for 100 years. For the elderly veterans in attendance, some of whom had fought in the Second World War, it was a moment of profound and long-awaited validation. The ceremony itself reflected the communities it honored, with African drumming and participation from a wide array of faith leaders, underscoring the diversity of the men and women who served. This memorial is more than just a monument. It is a permanent correction to the historical record. Standing proudly in Windrush Square, it reclaims a narrative that was deliberately erased. It challenges the myth of a white man's war by making the contribution of more than 2 million African and Caribbean soldiers an undeniable physical fact in the heart of London. It honors individuals like Alhaji Grunshi, a soldier in the Gold Coast Regiment who was the first in British service to fire a shot in World War I, and Walter Tull, the first Black British Army officer, who was killed in action in 1918 and whose body was never recovered. The memorial ensures that their stories and the stories of millions like them are no longer footnotes in history. It was built not by the state that forgot them, but by the descendants and community that refused. It is a testament to the power of memory over erasure, and a solemn promise that these heroes, once silenced, will now be remembered. The story of Britain's Great War Graves scandal is a tale of two memorials. One is the invisible, haunting memorial of hundreds of thousands of abandoned graves and unrecorded names, a monument to an empire's racist hypocrisy and its failure to uphold its most sacred promise. The other is a monument of dark Scottish stone in Brixton, a testament to a community's resilience and its power to reclaim history. The scandal reveals how easily a nation's story can be manipulated, not through overt lies, but through calculated omissions. It demonstrates how national myths, like the myth of a war fought only by white Europeans, can be built on a foundation of erased truths and silenced voices. The promise of equality in death was a revolutionary and noble idea, but it was shattered by the pervasive prejudice of the very men entrusted with its care. A century late, the painstaking work to identify the names and final resting places of every forgotten soldier is finally underway. But the Brixton Memorial stands as a permanent and powerful correction to the historical record, a monument built not by the state, but by the people. It ensures that we remember not only the heroes who fought and died for an empire that would not honor them, but also the modern-day heroes who fought for decades just to have them remembered. It proves that a name, once erased, can be reclaimed, and that a story, once silenced, can finally and forcefully be told. What does the story say about how we remember our own history? And what other stories are still waiting to be unearthed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps these important histories reach a wider audience. Thank you for watching.